Okay, so here we are looking at Absence by Elizabeth Jennings. So let's have a think about the context first of all. So she lived from 1926 to 2001, and she often explored relationships from the point of view of people's spirituality, vulnerability and sensitivity. By the 1960s, she was part of a group known as The Movement, and they reacted against pretension and the obscurity of expression. She had become one of the most popular poets in Britain, and she was regularly published alongside the likes of Philip Larkin. The poem Absence is a typical example of Jennings' famed clarity and directness, which plunges the reader immediately into the raw emotions of loss, sorrow and yearning, churning beneath the serene surface. Okay, so let's have a look at the first line of the first stanza even. In fact, we're going to look at the title first of all. So Absence, this is a very straightforward and also sort of simple and barren title, which right from the get-go creates a somber mood. And then the opening stanza goes, I visited the place where we last met. Nothing was changed. The gardens were well tended. The fountains sprayed their usual steady jet. There was no sign that anything had ended, and nothing to instruct me to forget. Okay, so obviously what's going on here is she's returning to a place they've been before, okay, where we last met. So look at that collective pronoun. There's a sense of togetherness there, isn't there? And obviously she's kind of reflecting upon these memories and feelings that she had. What's interesting is there's lots of caesura and end stops, so here, and here and here, so these are all examples of end stopping, and this is an example of caesura. Okay, and I think these pauses, this punctuation creates a pause. Now that's quite dramatic, which I think kind of focuses us on this idea that she's kind of revisiting sad memories and that there's a grief that's underlying it. But you could argue that these kind of pauses create an empty space, which are in themselves an absence. And I think they're also supposed to be reflective, and they certainly give it a reflective tone. Now, some people also interpret these verses in terms of structure as moving from the superego to the ego to the id. So there's a sense here that this is all about the kind of outside world that's constructed. There's also a semantic field of order and calm and control, or of happiness. And initially these first two that we've got are all about kind of order and control. Okay, so the gardens are well tended, they're looked after, the fountains sprayed in their usual steady jet. Okay, so there's a sense that the rest of the world, and nature in particular, is just carrying on, that nothing's changed for them. There was no sign that anything had ended. Okay, so outwardly, in the rest of the world, there's nothing to signify that something has changed, but actually underneath that, we'll come to see there's a great inner turmoil that she's experiencing. Okay, and that really becomes evident here, where we kind of enter into her ego and her thoughts. And the way that she presents nature here is interesting. So, the thoughtless birds that shook out of the trees, singing in ecstasy I could not share, played cunning in my thoughts. Surely in these pleasures there could not be a pain to bear, or any discord shake the level breeze. Now, level kind of reinforces that sense of kind of order and control that we had in the opening stanza, and there's still a sense that the rest of the world is carrying on, and it's nature again, isn't it? It's the wind, so the natural world's carrying on with this kind of steadiness. But the way that she presents nature changes slightly, because here, that I've highlighted in pink, we suddenly get the semantic field of kind of pain, cruelty and destruction. So the birds are thoughtless, they're inconsiderate, they're uncaring. Nature's happiness is actually an affront to her, it's a cruelty, because she herself is so miserable. Cunning is interesting as well, okay, because it connotes the sense of a villain. So these kind of beauties that she's seeing actually disrupt her thoughts and become kind of destructive and cruel. Got another example of caesura here, so another pause in the middle of the line, kind of creating an empty space and getting us to reflect. This is a really important line. Surely in these pleasures there could not be a pain to bear. Okay, so there's an opposition here, isn't there? That the rest of the world is kind of still happy and celebrating, particularly the natural world, but that makes her experience her sadness even more. So they reinforce the kind of misery of her life, because her experience is that she's an outsider to nature's joy. She can't revel in the pleasures that the natural world is experiencing. And actually, those pleasures become a sort of sly trick. That's why they're cunning. Discord is an interesting noun. Okay, it suggests kind of disagreement, doesn't it? But it also befits the idea of singing, because to be discordant in singing also suggests a lack of harmony. So I think that really helps us to see that she's in conflict with nature's joy. Shake, that verb's really showing us the kind of destructive element of this, and that escalates and is repeated in the final stanza as well. Okay, so increasingly we're seeing the turmoil that exists within her. So it's in this stanza that the kind of powerful antithesis that is evident throughout the poem really comes to the forefront. Okay, so there's this contrast between this semantic field in pink of pain and cruelty, and the semantic field of happiness and ecstasy and pleasures, and the semantic field of order and control and level. Okay, this antithesis creates a really powerful opposition, and I think that represents this sort of inner grief and turmoil that lies beneath this veneer of normality. And that's kind of comes through in this, the cunning in her thoughts, doesn't it? That the birds achieve their ends with deceit. The singing is like a sly trickery because she can't resonate with its happiness. Okay, let's come and look at the final verse. So she goes on to say, it was because the place was just the same that made your absence seem a savage force. For under all the gentleness there came an earthquake tremor. Fountain, birds and grass were shaken by my thinking of your name. Okay, so here we've got another example of things being the same. There's that control, there's that sense of order, but these feelings, these negative feelings that she's having, this earthquake tremor, come from exactly that sameness. Okay, and just the same. So it's exactly the same, nothing's changed, and she can't cope with that. She's kind of angry that it's the same. I guess what she really wants is to see her kind of misery and grief reflected in the world around her. So this is her kind of id starting to come through here, particularly when we see her kind of strong feelings here, where she uses the metaphor of an earthquake tremor. What that does is it suggests there's this really kind of violent shaking of her sense of self. So all of these repressed feelings, maybe that she's been trying to control and keep hidden, come exploding up to the surface. So here we get the poem's title come in the final verse as well. That made your absence seem a savage force. Now it's this absence, this kind of absence of a person. Okay, so that suggests a kind of that the person doesn't exist anymore, that there's an emptiness. And in terms of her feelings, I think also suggests that there is a numbness that she's experiencing, and that seems a savage force. Now this is important because obviously savage fits into this semantic field of destruction, and it suggests something that is fierce and violent and uncontrolled, doesn't it? And I think that fits in with this verse being from the id as well. Okay, that she can't control these feelings that are welling up in this earthquake tremor, and there's also, I think, a kind of cruelty and a hostility in it. For under all the gentleness. Okay, so again we've got that kind of positive semantic field that fits in with calmness. But that's the wider world. That's not that there's no gentleness within her. Okay, but maybe she's been kind of repressing her inner feelings and controlling them. There came an earthquake tremor. Now also note, we've talked about that metaphor, but after that metaphor we get another example of caesura. So it really makes us pause and focus on this earthquake tremor, and also to feel the absence. And then we get this triad, the fountains, the birds and grass, the things that were mentioned in the opening in the first verse, were shaken by my thinking of your name. Okay, so I think what she's saying here is that all of that natural beauty, all of the things in the wider world, actually the reason why she can't connect with it is because of her inner grief. Now also note that we get shake here, and that progresses to shaken. Okay, and I think that repetition is really emphasizing the strength of her emotions. So absolutely grief at the absence and the loss, but also despair and sadness. Right, let's quickly talk about the form as well. So Absence is a lyric poem as opposed to being a narrative or a descriptive poem, and that's because it has a musical rhythm, and also because it focuses on recalling or exploring emotions rather than telling a story or describing a scene or event. Throughout the rhyme scheme is a quintain, okay, so 5-line stanza form, and it's got this regular A, B, A, B, A rhyme scheme. So we've kind of got this odd number of lines, but quite a regular rhyme scheme, which is interesting. Potentially there's quite a contrasting effect there. I mean, I think potentially it definitely makes it sound like a sad song. It gives an impression of simplicity, the rhyme scheme, but that's deceptive. It's not actually that much of a simple poem. The regular rhyme scheme makes the person seem in control, okay, but the dramatic words of the third stanza tell us that that's definitely not the case. So we could suggest then that it's like the breaking out, basically. So kind of links into the way that she's kind of repressed her feelings. So the regular rhyme scheme is like the veneer that she's been trying to maintain, that sense of normality, but that actually she can't maintain it, and in the end her feelings, her grief explode outwards.